Welcome to the debate. When we look at a modern corporate spreadsheet, there is this profound sense of comfort in those rows and columns.
Oh, definitely. It feels incredibly clean.
Right. You have a cost on one side, a profit on the other. It presents this illusion of an entirely objective reality, which is basically a perfect mathematical abstraction of what is, in truth, the total chaos of human commerce.
Yeah, it is comforting. I mean, we naturally gravitate toward things we can measure, right? Especially when millions of dollars or, entire global economies are on the line. The spreadsheet is arguably the most powerful psychological shield in the modern boardroom.
Mm-hmm.
It completely sanitizes the stakes.
Exactly. But then when you step out of that abstraction and into the actual supply chain, where those rows and columns translate into hiring algorithms, resource extraction, the livelihoods of thousands of people, that clean spreadsheet suddenly feels radically incomplete.
Because it is the absolute definition of a moral blind spot. The mathematics of profit are designed to completely overshadow the human reality of the situation. It's a feature of the system, not a bug.
And that tension right there brings us to the core of our discussion today. When we look at the historical evolution of business ethics, from ancient philosophy all the way to the modern multinational corporation, we are essentially forced to answer one question.
Right.
When making critical business decisions, should leaders be guided primarily by the measurable outcomes and consequences of their actions, or must they be grounded in fundamental duties, character, and universal principles, regardless of what the data says?
Exactly. Because if you only look at the outcomes, if you are entirely obsessed with maximizing the metrics on that spreadsheet, you inevitably open the door to exploitation.
Well, and for our discussion today, I'll be taking the utilitarian side. I'm arguing that maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number actually provides the most objective, practical foundation for business.
And I will be representing deontology and virtue ethics, arguing that moral duty, fairness, and character development are essential, because without them, you can't prevent the exploitation that's inherent in those outcome-obsessed business models.
Okay, so I actually view the spreadsheet and the philosophy behind it as the most responsible tool we have. If we look at the foundation of utilitarianism, specifically rooted in the ideas of Jeremy Bentham, what we find isn't a license to exploit. It's a highly rational, functioning system for complex societies.
A highly rational system for turning people into numbers.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Bentham recognized that to govern human affairs, you need universality, objectivity, and quantifiability. He wanted to strip away the subjective, vague metaphysics that often cloud human judgment. So he introduced the concept of utility and the util.
Which is essentially treating human happiness like a monetary unit.
But think about why that is so vital. It gives us a quantifiable method for determining what is beneficial versus what is detrimental. Because utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, it scales perfectly into modern business.
Scales perfectly, sure. But at what cost?
Well, when a corporate leadership team sits down to do a global risk assessment, they can't rely on unprovable theories of inner virtue to tell them how 1 million customers will be impacted. They need to look at the data. They weigh the outcomes. They make the choice that demonstrably increases utility or decreases harm for the greatest number of people. It is really the only framework that scales objectively.
I come at it from a different way. It scales objectively, yes, but what it scales is a highly dangerous bottom-line mentality. The fundamental problem with a purely consequentialist approach is that the intent of the actors and the humane treatment of individuals in the minority are entirely sidelined.
But are they sidelined if the overall good increases?
Yes, because the outcome becomes the only determining factor. This is precisely why business history is littered with ethical catastrophes. We have to look to Immanuel Kant's deontology here. Kant insists that ethics must be grounded in duty, obligation, and goodwill, not just the calculation of results.
Right, but
You cannot direct human systems purely toward an aggregated outcome because when you do, you view people merely as variables in an equation. You lose the moral agent entirely.
But if the aggregated outcome results in, say, millions of people being lifted out of poverty or gaining access to life-saving technology, isn't the moral agent acting profoundly ethically by choosing that path?
Not if they had to crush a vulnerable minority to achieve it. Kant's categorical imperative is crucial here. We must act only according to a maxim that we could will to become a universal law. And practically speaking, we must never treat others merely as a means to an end, but always as ends in themselves.
Okay, let's test that in a modern context, because the theoretical divide here is fascinating. Let's look at the tech industry right now. Imagine a company deploying a massive, revolutionary artificial intelligence model.
Okay.
If we deploy it, we democratize medical diagnostics, legal assistance, and educational tutoring for hundreds of millions of people who previously couldn't afford it. The utilitarian calculus is staggering. The amount of global utils generated is astronomical.
And the cost. What is the other side of your utilitarian spreadsheet in this scenario?
Well, the cost is that the model was trained by scraping the copyrighted work, personal data, and intellectual property of a few 100,000 content creators and writers without their explicit consent or compensation.
Exactly. And there is the failure of Bentham's util.
Is it a failure, though? If we apply utilitarianism rigorously, the leaders of that company are forced to weigh the displacement of a few 100,000 professionals against the immediate, tangible betterment of hundreds of millions of people.
It's just theft on a grand scale.
It is a brutal calculation, yes. But if we treat ethics like a ledger, isn't utilitarianism the only framework that actually balances the books for the vast majority of human stakeholders?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. It balances the books using stolen capital. This is exactly what Kant warned against. By scraping the livelihoods and data of those creators without consent, the company is treating those individuals purely as a means to an end.
But the end is global democratization of knowledge.
They are raw material fed into a machine designed to benefit the majority and, conveniently, to massively enrich the shareholders. The utilitarian calculus in business almost always risks treating a minority of stakeholders as a sacrificial lamb. It doesn't matter how much good the AI does if the foundation of its creation violates the basic autonomy and rights of human beings.
I think that represents a slight misunderstanding of how a refined utilitarian framework operates in practice. Utilitarianism is not devoid of individual protection. John Stuart Mill, who refined Bentham's system precisely to address this kind of criticism, explicitly integrated human rights into the calculus.
Right, by introducing the harm principle.
Exactly. The harm principle dictates that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a community against their will is to prevent harm to others. Mill balanced utility with freedom. He recognized that you can't just have a tyranny of the majority.
But in a corporate context,
So in our AI example, a million utilitarian wouldn't just look at the raw output of the tech. They would have to calculate the systemic harm done to the concept of property rights, the economic harm to the creators, and the long-term chilling effect on human innovation. They would likely conclude that releasing the model without a compensation mechanism violates the harm principle. The consequentialist framework can absolutely protect the individual while still providing a rational mechanism for making hard choices.
Even if we accept that Mill's harm principle acts as a safeguard, which in corporate practice it rarely does, because harm is often redefined by corporate lawyers to mean legally actionable liability, the entire consequentialist framework still ignores the internal state of the decision-maker.
How so?
It constantly asks what will happen, instead of asking, who am I becoming by doing this?
Why does the internal state of the decision-maker matter if the external outcome is objectively good and minimizes harm?
Because the external outcome is rarely a single isolated event. Business is a continuous, compounding series of decisions. If the decision-maker's character is hollow, eventually the algorithms and the harm calculations will be manipulated to serve avarice. This is why ancient virtue ethics, like those of Aristotle and Confucius, are so desperately needed in modern corporate governance.
Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, right?
Yes, Aristotle argued that the point of a virtuous life was eudaimonia, or human flourishing.
He explicitly warned that wealth cannot be the ultimate good because money is merely a tool to get something else.
And Confucius had a very similar model, didn't he? The concept of the cultured, magnanimous leader.
Yes, the Junzi. And what's fascinating about the Junzi is how deeply practical it is for management. A manager anchored in virtue doesn't need to run a complex, algorithmic risk assessment to know how to treat their employees responsibly. Think about the Confucian concept of Quan, which translates to expediency, or the ability to weigh circumstances and find a practical balance.
How does Quan actually function in a boardroom, though? Because it sounds a bit abstract.
It's the exact opposite of abstract. Let's say a rigid corporate policy dictates that an employee must be fired for missing 3 consecutive shifts, no exceptions. The utilitarian HR algorithm flags the employee. Firing them maintains workplace discipline, maximizing overall productivity.
Which makes logical sense for the broader company.
Sure, and the deontologist might say, the rule was agreed upon, we have a duty to enforce the contract. But a manager exercising Quan looks at the context. They discover the employee is missing shifts because they are navigating a sudden, catastrophic family illness.
Oh, wow.
Quan is the wisdom to know when to break the rigid ritual, the formal rule, to prioritize responsive, humane action. The manager grants paid leave instead. They don't do it because they calculated the long-term retention metrics. They do it because their internal character demands they act with compassion.
I appreciate the humanity in that scenario, really I do. But my pushback is, how do you scale Quan? If I'm a stakeholder in a massive, interconnected global supply chain, I cannot look into the soul of a middle manager in a logistics hub 5,000 miles away to ensure they have achieved the enlightened state of a Junzi. I mean, I cannot measure their eudaimonia.
You don't think character scales?
I think human character is wildly inconsistent and highly susceptible to bias. I can't audit character, but I can audit actions against objective metrics. If we rely on individual managers to instinctively know the right thing to do based on their internal virtues, we are essentially relying on a subjective lottery.
I see what you mean, but
Some managers will be compassionate. Others will be deeply prejudiced, but convinced they're acting virtuously. Utilitarianism, for all its coldness, provides an external standard.
we don't have to rely purely on individual managers. We can institutionalize virtue and duty into the very structure of the corporation. If you want a systemic antidote to the cold calculations of utilitarianism, we have to look at John Rawls and his theory of justice. Rawls essentially took Kantian ethics and scaled it to the level of institutional design.
Right, by framing justice as fairness, building on social contract theory.
Exactly. Rawls posited what he called the original position, where rational people have to agree on how resources, rights, and duties are distributed in a system. To ensure this is actually fair and not just the powerful protecting their own interests, he introduced a thought experiment called the veil of ignorance.
And the mechanics of this are crucial for how we design modern businesses. Under the veil of ignorance, you design the rules of the society, or in our case, the structure and algorithms of a corporation, imagining you have zero knowledge of your own identity.
Yes, you don't know your age, your sex, your income level, your ethnicity, or your physical ability. Imagine applying that to the modern gig economy. Let's say you are tasked with designing the algorithm that dictates pay, route assignments, and deactivation for a ride-sharing platform.
Under the veil of ignorance, I wouldn't know if I am going to emerge as the CEO holding millions in stock options, or if I am going to be a driver in a saturated market, relying on the platform to feed my family.
Precisely. And because you don't know where you will end up, your inherent self-interest forces you to design a system that maximizes the welfare of the most disadvantaged person in that network. You eliminate the bias of the spreadsheet.
Interesting.
You would never design an algorithm that permanently deactivates a driver for a single missed rating. If you thought you might be that driver, you build in due process. You build in a living wage floor. Rawls outlines this procedurally. Maximize the welfare of the disadvantaged, ensure basic liberties, and create true equality of opportunity. This places fairness properly above utility. It creates the kind of cross-cultural systemic legitimacy that globalized businesses desperately need, because fairness is a universally understood language.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning. Because while it is a beautiful thought experiment, practically speaking, there is a massive systemic blind spot in Rawls's theory when applied to commerce. If we look at the textual criticism of Rawls specifically regarding distribution, decisions made under a veil of ignorance fundamentally fail to reward innovation, enterprise, and risk-taking.
How so? If the baseline is fair, people can still innovate.
Not necessarily. Let me offer an analogy from systems engineering. Imagine we are architects tasked with building a massive, unprecedented skyscraper, a metaphor for a revolutionary new industry. Rawls is essentially demanding that the entire design of the skyscraper be constrained by the load-bearing capacity of its weakest pillar. We have to design the entire structure to ensure that specific pillar is never overstressed.
I would argue we're ensuring the building doesn't collapse on the people living on the ground floor.
True, but if we optimize the entire design solely around protecting that one pillar, we can never build high enough to house the thousands of people who desperately need shelter. The building never reaches its potential. In business, if every single strategic decision must be made prioritizing only the most disadvantaged and avoiding all potential negative impacts on them, the risk capital vanishes.
But
the company never launches. While fairness is vital, commerce also fundamentally requires wealth creation, the assumption of risk, and aggressive strategic planning. This is exactly where utilitarianism excels. The utility function translates seamlessly into data analytics, measuring the viability of prospective projects and allowing leaders to take the calculated risks necessary to push society forward.
But risk management for whose benefit, that is the crux of the issue. Kant would argue that a corporate act is ethical only if it does not place the leadership's interests fundamentally above those of other stakeholders. When a company is using utilitarian data analytics to manage risk, the algorithm almost always defaults to maximizing shareholder return.
Not if the harm principle is applied.
But it treats the gig worker, the warehouse employee, and the natural environment as mere material to be consumed by the engine of progress. Rawls's justice theory ensures that when we build your skyscraper, we aren't using substandard concrete on the lower levels, just so the penthouse can have a better view.
But that implies utility functions are inherently malicious or devoid of humanity. That goes entirely against Bentham's foundational axiom, which is that we are aiming for the greatest happiness. Utilitarianism, when applied correctly, actually motivates individuals within an organization to take initiative in ways that enhance the collective good, because it aligns rational self-interest with societal progress.
It aligns them only when it is convenient. That is the vulnerability of consequentialism. What happens when doing the right thing offers absolutely no perceived benefit to the bottom line?
Well,
what happens when dumping toxic waste in a river is vastly cheaper than disposing of it properly? And the data analytics show the environmental fines will be less than the cost of compliance. Utility fails because the outcome incentivizes the wrong action.
and I think that brings us to the most vital point of convergence between these two supposedly opposing frameworks. Regardless of whether you are running a utilitarian calculus or adhering to Kantian duty, integrating personal and professional ethics requires a fundamental baseline. It requires two critical effects that the source material highlights beautifully. The first is exactly what you just touched on, motive.
Yes.
The willingness to do the right thing simply because it is the right thing, even when there's no immediate, measurable benefit. Even when the spreadsheet tells you the ethical choice is going to cost you margin.
Right.
And the second critical effect is awareness, the cognitive ability to actually see the ethical dimension in everyday choices. Whether you are using a risk assessment algorithm or striving to act as a Confucian Gen Z, you must first have the awareness that an ethical choice is even taking place.
Mm-hmm.
A spreadsheet doesn't flag an ethical dilemma. It just flags a deficit. Without motive and awareness, any framework, utilitarian or deontological, collapses into mere rationalization for whatever the company wanted to do anyway.
Absolutely. If the decision maker lacks awareness, they will just use Kant or Bentham to justify their own avarice after the fact.
As we wrap up our exploration of this material, my perspective remains that utilitarianism, refined by thinkers like Mill, provides the necessary objective metrics for evaluating incredibly complex, globalized business realities. By relying on universality and quantifiability, it gives leaders a rational mechanism to manage risk, allocate resources efficiently, and ultimately ensure the greatest good in an interdependent market.
And my perspective is that without the categorical imperative of Kant to protect the individual, the systemic fairness of Rawls to protect the disadvantaged,
or the virtuous character outlined by Aristotle and Confucius to guide the manager, business inevitably devolves. Without duty, commerce becomes a machine entirely devoid of human focus, where people are reduced to mere tools for wealth replication.
The complexity of modern business ethics clearly requires a continuous, often uncomfortable evaluation of both the outcomes we produce and the fundamental duties we uphold. We invite you, the listener, to explore the source material further to determine which framework you believe should ultimately guide modern commerce.
It is a tension we all face, whether we are designing global AI algorithms or just trying to manage a team with fairness and dignity.
Indeed. Because at the end of the day, when you look down at that flawlessly balanced corporate spreadsheet, you have to ask yourself a very difficult question. Are you just looking at the math, or do you have the awareness to see the people hidden inside the margins?